Perhaps we can talk about the shadow, this notion of the shadow. Sounds very ominous. What is the shadow, and are people aware of their shadows? And if they're not, how can they become aware of them? And how can they work with them?
Well, a shadow was Jung's metaphor for those parts of our own psyche and or our affiliation with groups, for example, whether it's a religious group, educational group, a national identity, that when brought to consciousness, we find troubling, perhaps contradictory to our values, or inimical to our sense of self-worth or something like that. For example, typical shadow issues include our capacity for jealousy and for envy, for aggression, for greed, et cetera, et cetera. We don't want to acknowledge those things, but since when are we exempt from the human condition? The wisest thing ever said about the shadow came from the Latin playwright Terence 2 millennia ago, who said, nothing human is alien to me. Now, I think that's important to recognize. In me, I carry the entire capacity of human nature to express itself. Some of those forms of expressions will be acceptable to the society or to my psychological culture, and some will not be. And that's the shadow material. And, there's the personal shadow and there are group shadows, because nations can be possessed by bloodlust, for example, or a fashion is a shadow issue where everybody has to look the same way and dress the same way and so forth. The more insecure I am as a person, the more likely I'm going to try to look around me for what are the clues so I can fit in, be like others, and therefore I'll be acceptable, you see. That's not a federal crime. That's a very deep complex that is left over from childhood. I'm not here to fit in. I'm here to be who I am, which at times will fit in and other times it won't. But that's okay, because I'm at least in good relationships to myself at that point. So typically the shadow manifests as being unconscious, therefore it just spills into the world through us. A perfect example of shadow issues, as I mentioned before, is parents expecting their children to grow up and have, the same kind of values that I have, for example, same religious views, marry somebody that I find acceptable, et cetera, et cetera. Well, that's not really loving the otherness of the other, is it? It's not really loving the child for their own journey. That's them carrying some piece of their own unfinished business. Secondly, we disown the shadow by projecting on some, those people across the border there, they're the carrier. They're what's wrong with this world, you see. I disown the shadow in myself by seeing it in everybody else around me. Jung actually said what often we find troubling in another person is because they're expressing something within our own unconscious. As a certain itinerant rabbi said 2 millennia ago, I can see the speck in your eye, but miss the log in my own. That's a perfect illustration of what the shadow is. Thirdly, one can get caught up in it. That's at times what rock concerts are, mass events. People are caught up in a mob mentality, where you lose your sense of individual ego identity and become subsumed into a collective mood. And, that could be a hanging mob, for example, as has happened in history too many times. And it could be a force for good or a force for evil. But again, the larger the group, the lower the level of consciousness of the individuals in that group. And then fourthly, we recognize it in ourselves. In a speech at Yale University in 1937, Jung said, a person who could look at their own shadow and own it, he said, now has a large problem because they're no longer to blame others for what goes wrong in their life. They have to acknowledge that within themselves. And he said further, it's the single best thing you can do for your society. This is not navel gazing. This is how you lift your unfinished business off of your partner, your children. Take it back yourself, which is a loving thing to do and a civic-minded thing to do if you look at it collectively here.
So how does one learn what their shadow or shadows?
Well, again, if you're married, ask your partner.
Sure.
Who will tell you immediately what your unfinished business may be, or your children, or your close friend, perhaps. It shows up in dreams. Freud talked about a young man who's disowned the content of his dream. He says, well, I don't, Freud said, well, whose dream do you think that was? It was your dream. You have to acknowledge that was embodying something within you. So there are many ways to recognize the shadow. Often consequences pile up, and then one begins to realize, well, the only consistent person in all the scenes of this drama I call my life is moi. So I have to acknowledge that that's my stuff. And that's a very humbling thing. That's why I say this work is humbling, not inflating in some way. It's humbling. So again, shadow work is never going to be popular because it means I'm taking responsibility. And yet, what else would being a human being who's responsible and adult-like do except accept responsibility, you see? It's one of the definitions, I would say, of an adult person is I know I'm accountable for what spills in the world through me. Yes, I'm responding to various things that happen around me, but sooner or later, I'm the one bringing my stories, my conditioned responses, and something of my shadow to the mix and responding out of that. Now, that's a witch's brew at times, as you could imagine. At the same time, you recognize, all right, but that's my business to address, because if I don't, it just continues.
What I observe in the world and what I've experienced before is that certainly we all have shadow sides, me, everybody. I mean, yes. I think that's I think anyone that doesn't believe that is perhaps not of Homo sapiens. Maybe other animals have shadows too. Who knows? But that when shadows clash, it becomes very confusing because given what you're saying, very few people address their shadows. And these days, especially, there's no need to make this political. This is just social.
Sure.
We see mobs forming. As you said, the larger the group, the lower the level of consciousness. And then it becomes even more challenging to address one's shadow when A, there's the perception of an attack. Mm-hmm. B, that attack oftentimes is the reflection of the other group's shadow. And C, people find refuge with people who have similar shadow
yes.
processes. So it, not to be pessimistic here, but perhaps the answer is what you referred to before, is to go inward to the self, work with somebody or somebody close to you that has your best interest in mind, truly best interest in mind, and then try to resolve that.
Well, yes, and very few people are willing to do that. That's what polarizes societies, polarizes groups, and so forth. It's comforting to find like-minded people, but then they're both caught in the same complex is another way of putting that. So ultimately, whatever reality is, it's going to wear through that and reveal something that's going to be pretty disconcerting to individuals who are caught in a collective identification that way. The shadow comes because our human nature is thrust into various social situations. We can't help but have a shadow. We have to socialize a child. We learn to use a knife and a fork and not take our siblings' food and that sort of thing. You learn to look both ways before you cross the street. There's socialization that's important, and yet the greater the socialization, the more likely there's going to be an interruption. I mean, think about those cultures where people are forced to dress alike for some form of unity or conformity. Think about where a person might have a special gift or talent, but it's not appreciated in family X or Y. Well, where does that natural form of expression go? It pathologizes as depression, or it comes out in compensatory dreams or in projections onto someone else, or it makes the person ill. The unlived life can make a person ill. There's a sickness unto death, as Kierkegaard talked about it. It's that sickness where the human spirit is being repetitively violated, and much in our culture violates our spirits. And spirit is not something you will. It's something that is the quickening of life's energy in service to something. And if your family or your situation imposes itself upon that. To give a quick example, my own family of origin was one in which they were, by the circumstances of decades ago, unable to attain an education. My father worked in a factory, my mother was a secretary. And for them, life was a series of shaming events and overwhelming events. And the message to me, both overt and covert, is don't go out there. It's too big, it's too much. Stay here and we'll take care of each other. So one of the first things I did when I was 18 was left. I went to college and came back for vacations, but I left psychologically at that point. Something in me knew that I had to have a larger life than that. And I say that with love and respect and compassion for my parents. The last conversation I had with my mother before she died of cancer, her ancestor, the father she'd never known, was from Sweden. And I'd had a book translated into Swedish. And I told her I thought that would be something that would be nice for her. And she was horrified. It's like, why have you written it? What are they saying? And I thought she meant reviewers at first. And I realized that's the voice I heard in childhood. She was saying, you shouldn't be out there. Now people are going to attack you. This will draw attention to you, you see. And her intention was protective. In her last days, actually, before she died, she was more afraid of what people thought than whether her son was living his journey or not. And I say this with grief for her. And that was the message of childhood, it's too much out there. And yet something inside quickened and said, well, you need to go where those airplanes are going. You need to go see the ocean for yourself. You need to try to live in a foreign country and see what that's like. Was that easy? No, it was doubly hard because of the messages I had, but it was just necessary. Sooner or later, again, the appointment with your life, do you keep it or you not keep the appointment? So that was the first meeting of the appointment, was to leave home and start the journey. In terms of the archetype of the journey, first is the departure. And then you have the initiatory experiences, which can knock you down. And then the question is, do you get up and go to the next one? And sooner or later, something begins to change inside, and you begin to feel that this is the journey that's right for me.